Yeah, so I'm going to talk about how not to build a flow. So we're going to talk about best practices. We're going to talk about naming conventions. We're going to talk about more advanced techniques as well. So we're trying to go from basic level 50 things to like super advanced. Takes me a while to figure out how it works, sort of things. Um, so we're going to do why building flows badly. Why building flows poorly is bad. Uh, some top 10 tips, but spoiler, there's more than 10. Some resources that can help you, and hopefully, with the extra 5 minutes, I'll have time for Q&A. So a little bit of an introduction about me. I am Matt Collins-Jones. Most people call me MCJ because Matt Collins-Jones is a bit of a mouthful. I'm a senior Power Platform solution architect working for Capgemini in the UK. I'm a Microsoft MVP, I'm a Microsoft MCT. You'll probably see that trainer part come out a lot during this session because I just like teaching people everything. And I've been working with Power Platform for over 10 years. I come from the old school CRM on-prem 4.0 days. So if anyone's a CRM 4.0, I can relate to all your worries and all your troubles from back then. So, why is building flows poor? Why building flows poorly is bad. Um, Firstly, whenever I start a new project or get involved in a project that's already existing, I try and go, where's the flow? Like, where's the flow that does this? I'm searching through solution files, I'm searching through like default solutions and things like that, and you just can't find the flow if you don't name them correctly. So that's why it's bad. Confusion. What on earth does this flow do? Like how does it work? What does it do? What tables does it touch? What automations or what integrations does it do? Just craziness if you don't know, if you don't do it properly. Cost, it can cost you a lot of time. Time is money, so the longer you spend troubleshooting something and trying to figure out how something works rather than properly building it in the first place, and if you build it poorly, it can take you a lot of time and energy, and then there's refactoring costs and all sorts. So yeah, cost is definitely a reason why you shouldn't build flows poorly. Performance. I love this GIF. When something just unexpectedly gets in your way, unexpectedly gets in the way of your performance, you should absolutely worry that flows are not performant enough, especially in your larger organizations or flows that will run a lot. Supportability. I come from a support desk background, so this is me. Like why is it built this way? This doesn't work. How are we going to support it going forward? And scalability. If you build something and don't have the best practices in mind, if you suddenly go from your one or two 10 run flows to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, and you haven't thought about the scalability of it, it's not going to end very well for you. So what we're going to cover is my top 10 tips for building flows. As I said, there is kind of 11 there. Some of the start ones are very basic, and we're going to go straight through into more advanced techniques and kind of explain why these things are useful in these things. So, demo time. I'm going to stop sharing. Then I'll reshare screen. Oops, that's my Outlook, my Teams. Where's my window? Over here. So we're going to start at the beginning with flow names. So this is my solution. You should always build flows in solutions. That's a bonus tip. This is my solution, and it's got two flows in it. It's got this one, account C, when a new account is created, create account number, sync with on-prem ERP, and button dash greater than compose, comma, terminate. One of these is a good naming convention and one of them is not. This is the naming convention I've been using since building classic workflows in Dynamics. So starting with account name, the table name being account. I've recently adopted this CUD methodology. So inside brackets afterwards, create, update, and delete. So how are we triggering the flow? What's it doing? Easy way to kind of filter through and see, right, if this one's running on create and this one's running on update, then maybe we should look at the one that's running on the update, because that's where we're triggering the flow from and stuff like that. Naming is important because, again, if you have all these things grouped together, it just means there's an really easy way to find things. I've been thinking about lots of different naming conventions for things. So how you name things triggered from Power Apps or manual triggers, or how you name them from different integrations and things like that. So generally table names, sometimes data source names, sometimes application names. You can break these down in sort of business units as well. So if you have a sales application and this flow runs inside that sales application, potentially think about adding that to the naming convention. So again, if you're searching for flows, you can filter it and basically find it. If you don't know which solutions it's in, you can look in the default solution and then find the one that's causing the problem the easiest. So naming convention is really important, because it's the first place you're going to look for flows. And if it's not easy to find, you don't want to waste your time looking through these things. Secondly, description. Most people don't know that there's a description box for Power Automate for all your flows. So if you're inside a flow, you can click on this edit button and you do get a description box up here, and you can add different things into here. So I like to use this as maybe an initial place for basic flows. So if I need notes of when we built this flow, when we added additional things, when we needed to make changes, it's really handy to be able to have these things inside of Power Automate, and that way you can see what happened and who updated what and when. There is a limit to this box. I think it's like 500 or 1,000 characters or something like that, and I have hit that limit before. But this is kind of a good place to put things in the interim. So you can put things like Azure DevOps ticket numbers in here, and there are solutions out there where you can download and automate deployment notes and notes for your flows using this description box. So it is an additional option. If you start to run out of space in here and you do like this methodology, you can add a compose step into the first part of your flow, or a different, or like maybe after your flow terminates, with all the release notes as well. So another really good place to add notes and add additional details into your flow so that you know what your flow is doing. Oops, wrong button. What your flow is doing and when. So with that, we're going to take a look at the flow itself. So I have a flow here that has two paths. We're going to call it the good path on the left and the bad path on the right. So we're going to start with the trigger and naming things and renaming things. I can hear my son starting to cry, so I'm wondering if I'm too loud. So you should always start with triggers and naming those correctly. So I would, again, put in a short description of what it is you're doing. So when an account is created, when your table name is updated, when a file drops into a thing, when a file's uploaded, something like that, is what I would kind of stick with in terms of the naming convention of the trigger here. I do recommend naming and renaming things as you go along. So don't come back at the end and rename things afterwards, and we'll try to get to that. So as you go down to the different actions here, you can see that I've renamed things as we go along. So get account record is something I've renamed. Get row by ID2 is something that I've not renamed. And this kind of causes a problem later on if you're starting to rename things later. So if you rename them as you go along and try to stick to a naming convention where at least the first part of it is still going to be related to the action that you're doing. So get as in get row, list as in list rows, crate as in crate item in SharePoint, and then add a small description in of what you're doing, is going to make your flow super readable and super supportable. So that when you come back and look at your flow, you can see that that's the reason why it's that's the action that you're doing. So you understand that that's the action that you need to look at. So I know that a get record is only going to return a single record. I know a list rows is going to return an array of rows. So I know how to handle the data from each one of those things differently. If I use a list rows, I know I'm going to potentially have an array and a loop needed, whereas a get rows, I won't. So I mentioned renaming things as you go along, and one of the reasons to do that is actually because of expressions. So down here I have a compose action, and if I add in an expression in here, I will add a concat. We'll say this, and then we'll choose the generic content for this get row by ID 2. Account name here. We can see that the formula that it creates is body get row by ID 2 name. If I hit add, it's updated in there. If I go to this row and rename this something else, like that, and go back to my compose, I don't know why it does this. I tested this earlier and it didn't do this, and every time I come to do this on a demo, it always works. But generally, what you'll find is that it doesn't update this function. It doesn't update this value. So again, it's always welcome to do the demo, but I tested this just before this call, and it wasn't working. So your mileage may vary, new interface may change things, but generally great practice to just rename as you go along. So that's one thing. Second thing, in a world of hyper automations and where things may be running thousands of times or hundreds of thousands of times, and in October, when Microsoft finally enforce and lower the API limits for Power Platform, you're going to be thinking about your API calls that you're doing inside of all your flows. So for instance, every step in a flow is an API call, or even a compose action is an API call. A loop and all the things running in the loop are multiple API calls per loop that you're going through. So you should always try and shape your data in ways that will avoid unnecessary API calls. So if you want to do mass updates, for instance, you can maybe bundle those up as one API call and then send them, instead of looping through records, which is a more advanced technique. In this scenario, what I've got is a list primary contact by account here. So I've got a list rows action, and then I've got a compose step here. And my compose step uses a first function. So get the first output of this array and give me this name. So this won't work in all situations where you do actually potentially need all the values and need the array of values. But in certain situations where there'll only ever be one result, for instance, a primary contact on account will only ever give you a single result, but is unfortunately a list of an array, it will automatically give you an apply to each, which will consume more API calls than just using a function like this, an expression like this, to get out that single value. So it's a good idea to think about these things, and especially as you scale upwards. Again, it's not a big deal for smaller organizations that maybe don't have too many flows running and stuff like that. But if you start with these better practices from the off, if those flows do turn into larger ones, and if you do move to larger organizations and larger projects, getting these things in now is actually a really great practice. So with that, another thing that I like to tell people about is comments. So comment, but don't comment. And what I mean by that is There is a comment functionality, which is like your Office 365 comments in documents like Excel and Word and stuff like that. But there are also notes inside of Power Automate. Notes are stored inside the flow. Comments are stored in Dataverse as records. So if you move this flow from your dev environment to your test environment and then to your production environment, and support go to troubleshoot something in the production environment, they will not see any of the notes that you've put for any of your code in here. So it's a good idea to put in notes and not comments into your code to comment it, but not note it, if that makes sense. So use notes. They're a really useful feature. Again, there are limits to the number of characters you can have in here, but it's a good idea to get used to this, get used to adding notes in, especially for your more complex flows where you may need to remember what you do in the future. So with that, we'll look at Stropes. So Stropes are a really handy action and not one that many people really use, which is a shame because they are really great. Stropes allow for two things, in my opinion. One is they're really great at cleaning up your flows, especially your larger flows, because you can group multiple actions together inside of Stropes and allow you to collapse and expand. Not so much a big issue in the new V3 design because it doesn't save you that much space here. Maybe it does when you get larger ones. But in the old designer, collapsing massive Stropes was a really handy way to kind of navigate through, especially larger flows, and find the right pieces of information. But the other thing that they do really well is error handling, which is the next tip. So error handling in Power Automate is we usually use a try-catch method of you try and do an action, and if that fails, catch the error. Now, you do that by doing what we call configure run after. So in this stroke here, you can see I've got these dots above, which is the new visual indicator for configure run after in the new V3. So if I go over to settings and click and expand this, we can see that this stroke, if this stroke runs successfully, then it doesn't go to this stroke. But if it has timed out, if it's skipped, or if it's failed, we're going to go to this error handling stroke. So by using Stropes, you could potentially have multiple actions inside of your flows. And if any one of those actions fails, your error stroke can capture the error message. And there is an additional function called result, which is a logic apps function, but works in Power Automate because they share the same or similar code bases. And it allows you to capture an error message from that stroke itself, and then send that error message to whoever, or log it in a table or do something. So you should always think about error handling, and Power Automate is getting better with the different functionality you have. I've actually just noticed while doing this demo that I have a version history up here now, which I didn't have a few days ago. Yeah, there is the concept of error handling and doing something with those errors. I said there are new features and functionality coming in to help you with error messages and things like that. But for now, I've been doing things like logging them in Dataverse tables, logging them in Azure tables and things like that so that we can get statistics about what's going on. So things like result, workflow to get the URL of the flow that fails, all really handy things. We should also talk about child flows. Child flows are really useful, especially when you want to think about things like not necessarily composable architecture, but kind of like reuse and reusable architecture. If you have something that you do a lot and maybe just some of the parameters change as you're doing it, then child flows are really great. So one of the projects I was working on recently was talking about using child flows as email template records. So you pass a child flow, the who, the what, the subject, the details, and any of the other stuff. And then you just have one flow that houses your email templates, meaning that every time you need to change a template, you change it in one flow and not 50 flows for all the different times that you need to do it. So really good for that. And you can kind of use this to offload flows to do different things as well. Just one example, so child flows are a really handy tool to use. Custom connectors. So I have a custom connector down here. This is my custom connector. This is a one that goes to a company called Companies House, which is a government organisation in the UK that houses all the information about UK businesses. So this connector can have multiple actions. It can query different things, I can input different parameters, and the idea is that I build a custom connector once and deploy it to the environments that need it, and then they can consume those actions in a more easy to understand mechanism. If I wasn't going to do that, I would have to put a HTTP action in for all the different connections that I wanted. So you'd have to put in ones for your specific gets. So this one's connected to Icon has dad joke. So I'd have to create one for Icon has dad joke and just get a random joke. I'd have to create one for get 10 random jokes, get a random joke about this, get a random joke about that. And I'd have to build in that HTTP connection every time and that step every time, rather than using a custom connector, which again is another form of reuse, where you can build it once, deploy it multiple times, and it's easier to configure. So custom connectors are a really useful function. Right, that is the end of my demo. I'll flip back to the slides. I do have a bunch of slides, but I'm just going to whip through them pretty quickly because it's just kind of going over what I've just been talking about, and I will provide the slides to Aidan and the team so that they can be distributed out. So naming conventions. As I said, names are important. You should always really start with a good naming convention. Think about how you want to do it and maybe standardize across all your flows in your organization. I tend to like table name or app name. Abbreviations, try to keep them to a minimum, but you can use some, especially if they're relevant to your organization. They just make things easier to find and easier to debug. So flow descriptions, again, just something that people don't use a lot. You can do all sorts of things with them. Gives you traceability of who updated what flow, if people remember to do it, and can give you some of the common components. And you can also use it to store things like if it's a child flow, list where the parent flow is. If it's a parent flow, list what child flows it touches and things like that. So because that's kind of one of the problems of child flows is sometimes finding parent flows. So good idea to store those if you can. Rename actions and triggers and do it as you go along. Maintaining some reference to the trigger and action is usually a good idea, so you know what the actual action is. Check that it makes sense and it's not too long. I'd also avoid different characters if you can, so spaces instead of dashes and things like that. I'm not saying you can't be used, but if you had to write an expression for it, it kind of makes it a little bit more complicated with space, like underscore, dash, underscore, this. So again, just make them easier to understand. Use expressions. So you should always really use expressions when you can. If things like try to avoid ifs, massive if statements and nested if statements, try using switches. Switches are revolutionary the first time you find them and you made your like 17 nested ifs. All these things will help your flow be more performant, reduce API calls, and do things a lot easier. And there's all sorts of other things that aren't necessarily just expressions, but just ways to shape your data. Things like the select function and stuff like that are really useful functions. Make notes, not comments. So comment without commenting. It's good to just add some additional context. I always think about the three mats. There is the present mat, there's the past mat, and there's the future mat. So if the present mat does things right and writes the comments down and builds things in a good way, then future mat will be really happy. And if future mat comes to a flow and nothing's working, he's going to be really annoyed at past mat. So always think about your three selves, and when you should do things right and do the extra work and add that extra comment in, so that when future mat comes to it, he actually knows why you did that thing in the first place. So always useful to do. Stropes, really useful function, not used that much. A lot of people just use them for error handling, and they tend to make your code and your flows a lot nicer as well. So absolutely do that and make sure you're error handling in your flows as well. Again, error handling, you can do things like configure on after. Stropes make things a lot easier and a lot simpler. You can log errors, you can notify people about errors, and you can send flow URLs, so you can make it easy, just one click and just open it. So really useful, you should absolutely do that. As I said, Power Automate is starting to add in a few more things with everything being a bit more entrenched in Dataverse. So yeah, absolutely do that. Child flows, again, useful function, reusable, offload things to child flows to make sure that you're not having to rebuild the same thing over and over again, which makes a lot of sense. Custom connectors, again, why build things more than once when you can build them once and deploy everywhere? It makes it easier, especially for makers or citizen developers, to use a custom connector instead of saying, hey, you need to call an API, go and find this API and figure out how this HTTP action works. Educate yourself and the others around you. I think this is one of the most important things, is understanding the platform and understanding how it works and understanding functions and everything else. Microsoft have had this big message of low code and no code makes anyone a developer, and that's great. But with Power Automate, you can do very basic things until you need to understand a bit more. So my advice is go out there, learn the functions, learn how the connectors work, build a custom connector because that'll be fun. Learn what JSON is if you don't know what JSON is, and learn about APIs, because you'll need all of these things in Power Automate to really up your Power Automate games. And then the advantages of this are things like reducing API calls because you know what you're doing, and you can build things roughly. I'm going to click next slide. So learn some advanced techniques. There are lots of advanced tutorials, and I will admit I've been working with Flow for like 5-6 years, however long it's been out for now. I still don't understand some of these things, but there are some great things out there. So there's a thing called Peter's method on SharePoint.com. Peter Venstrom is a MVP in the UK. He realized that variables are very slow and compose actions are very fast in loops. So if you reference a compose action from outside of a loop, you actually get an array of the results, which means you can turn on the maximum concurrency, and it takes updating a variable from minutes to seconds, things like that. Damien Bird has a great YouTube with loads of really cool videos. He does all sorts. He's an ex-MVP, joined Microsoft now, and he does loads of videos that I'd like comparing different things and all sorts of just crazy flow techniques. So definitely check him out. For the Dynamics people among us, you can dynamically build vector checks and alt queries using Power Automate by using different compose actions and other things, which is really handy, especially if you don't know all the data that you're going to need, but you still need a list rows action on something. So I keep meaning to write a blog article about this, but it's a really useful thing. And results and other hidden gems that come across from logic apps you should check out. shameless self-promotion here. Coding standards are really important, and that's kind of why I'm doing this presentation today, is you should do things in a very specific way. I don't care which coding standards you use, just as long as you have some. Here is mine on the left, the thing that I've called the Artemis framework. Matt Diavani wrote blog articles last year about them as well. So these are just two examples. You don't need to copy ours. You can use them as a reference. You can build your own, but just come up with a coding standards, come up with a framework and a methodology for creating flows that make sense to everyone, or you have documentation that explains it, and stick to that, because it's going to make your life so much easier. And if I didn't have all the technical issues, I probably would have more time for questions, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And if you need to chat with me, that is my link tree there. You can find all my links for my GitHub, which includes my coding standards, Twitter, X, LinkedIn, everything else. So, other than the technical issues, thank you.
Nice.